Based on the beliefs of Karl Marx that I covered in part 1, which I recommend you watch first, we should already be able to guess what the illustration of the capitalistic system should look like. Let's try to imagine the average experience of a worker and a capitalist, specifically a factory worker and the capitalist who owns the factory. Instead of applying their labor to nature to create value, a worker will apply his labor to a factory that is owned by a capitalist. The worker creates value in the form of a commodity, but the worker doesn't keep it for himself. Instead, the capitalist keeps the created commodity and exchanges it for a wage, a money commodity of equal value. At this point, the worker and the capitalist take their respected forms of value and either use them or, far more likely, exchange them on the market, the place where all other commodity exchange occurs. After exchanging for commodities of equal value, the worker and the capitalist use the values, reproduce themselves, and repeat the process again. That is how most people might experience the capitalistic system, but Marx would argue that there is more going on than meets the eye, which he would call a mystification of the situation. It is at this point I will begin to illustrate what Marx believes is actually occurring, illustrating what he is most popularly known for and what most, if not all, leftists believe to be the case.
I am Artistic Layman, and this is Demystifying Marx, Part 2, Capitalism.
Most people might say that capitalism is a system of people buying and selling whatever they make for whatever they want in a free market. However, according to Marx, capitalism is first and foremost a system where capitalists create capital. But what exactly is a capitalist, and what is capital? A capitalist, like a worker, is a human who needs to create and consume value to reproduce himself. The biggest difference is that the capitalist does no labor whatsoever and pays others to labor for him. Marx says that if the capitalist does any labor at all in the creation of value, he or she is not actually a capitalist. This would mean that most small businesses would not be considered capitalistic enterprises, which is why most of Marx's criticism is directed at factories, where a great deal of labor organization takes place. Marx argues that when the worker applies his labor to the factory, he is not just creating value for himself, he is also creating value for the capitalist, which is called surplus value. This surplus value is not only for maintaining and reproducing the capitalist, but also for the creation of something else, capital. Capital is value that creates even more value, and it is the driving force of the capitalistic system. Most people might better recognize capital as profit and/or investment, and it goes back into the factory, which maintains and reproduces it. Just so we are on the same page, according to Marx, when the worker is applying his labor to the factory, he is creating value not just to reproduce himself, but also for the capitalist and the factory. In other words, the worker is reproducing the capitalistic system itself. But based on what I went over in part 1, how is that possible? If value is always exchanged for equal value, how is it that the worker receives wages for the value created, but not the surplus value? According to Marx, it is because of certain phenomena that happen in the factory that don't happen in nature. The extension of the workday, the use of machinery, and the transformation of labor into a commodity. The extension of the workday means that instead of the worker instantly receiving the value he creates for self-reproduction, the worker will only get the value after doing the agreed-upon work for the capitalist, which is of course always more than is needed. The use of machinery means that a worker is able to produce more commodities for the capitalist for the same amount of labor, because machinery is a tool that has the ability to amplify labor power. The transformation of labor into a commodity is the simple fact that a worker is not actually applying his labor to the factory. What is actually happening is that the worker is selling his labor to the capitalist. Another way of saying it is that he is trading his labor for a wage, as if his labor itself was a commodity. The downside of this is that the value of the labor as a commodity is always less than the value that the labor itself creates. Because of these combined phenomena, more value is created by the worker while appearing that the worker has been equally compensated. It's a kind of magical sleight of hand trick perpetrated by the capitalist without the capitalist even realizing it. Even the capitalist who does realize it has an active incentive to not address it. After all, every unit of value that the capitalist gives to the worker in the form of money is one less unit of surplus value that goes to the reproduction of himself and to capital. And as long as the workers receive enough value in the form of money to reproduce themselves, nobody needs to be the wiser about it. This disparity of value created by the worker and value received in payment is what Marx refers to as exploitation. It is what leftists are referring to when they say the workers are not getting a fair wage, despite any agreement between the workers and the capitalists. Now, at first glance, this illustration of the capitalistic system as detailed by Marx appears horribly unfair, but the more optimistic and uncritical observers might say it is no big deal. After all, everyone is getting enough value for reproduction, and the system is producing more commodities than otherwise would have been made, so despite the so-called exploitation, everyone is better for it. But Marx goes on to say that there is something to be concerned about. According to Marx, the biggest difference between the reproduction of labor and the reproduction of capital is that while labor reproduces at a constant rate, the nature of capital is to grow and reproduce at an ever-expanding rate. After all, capital is a value that creates more value, and the way it does so is by expanding the exploitation of the workers. Or to be technical about it, capital reproduces the expansion of exploitation. As you can imagine, this expansion causes some problems. It requires the capitalists to exploit their workers even more to make even more commodities. This then requires the capitalist to find even more people to sell the commodities to, and even more resources and workers to make the next batch of commodities. This increase of gathering resources and workers is what leftists refer to as colonialism or imperialism. However, this gets even more complicated with the improvement of machinery. One of the things capital does is create more advanced machinery, which further amplifies the labor power of the worker. This can mean that the capitalist needs less labor from workers to create commodities, but another way to say it is that the capitalist needs fewer workers to create commodities, which basically means unemployment. And what's more, this unemployment also gets reproduced with every increase of capital reproduction, making more people unemployed and desperate to work for any wage to reproduce themselves. Next, we must consider that the abundant commodities being created with machinery have less value in them. Since labor creates value and value anchors prices, and machinery amplifies labor power, each new commodity created only has a fraction of the value they would have if the machinery wasn't used. This means that while more commodities are being created, the workers need to use and consume more commodities just to reproduce themselves. Meanwhile, the capitalistic system is expanding, needing more resources and workers to make even more commodities. The system is spiraling out of control, and according to Marx, it is an inevitable certainty that it will collapse in on itself. At this point, the capitalists have a dilemma. Either they push the capitalist system harder by inventing new methods of exploitation and imperialism for the creation of capital, or they give it up and consider alternatives. Unfortunately, Marx does not have much hope for the alternatives, since the capitalistic system is all the capitalists have ever known. Every aspect of society, from the depths of the education system to the heights of government legislation, has been devoted to the creation of capital, to the point where capitalists invent ideologies and mythologies justifying the exploitation and imperialism that comes with it. This is the reason why Marx advocated the violent overthrow of the capitalistic system through a workers' revolution. Whatever pain and violence might be committed during this revolution, it will be, according to Marx, lesser than the prolonged pain and suffering caused by the reproduction and expansion of capitalism. So what happens after the revolution? We will now consider what Marx says about what happens after capitalism, which I will do in part 3. Stay tuned. Until next time, may the will of God be your way.